Sarah Martinez had always been small. At 5 feet 2 and barely weighing 115 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a United States Marine. When she walked through the gates of Camp Pendleton for the first time, carrying her duffel bag that seemed almost as big as she was, the other Marines couldn't help but stare. Some whispered among themselves, wondering how someone so tiny had made it through boot camp at Paris Island. The whispers followed her everywhere during those first weeks. In the chow hall, fellow Marines would glance over as she struggled to balance her tray loaded with food she could barely finish. During physical training sessions, they watched as she pushed herself harder than anyone else just to keep up with the pack. The obstacle course was particularly challenging for someone of her stature, but Sarah never complained, never asked for help, and never gave up. Her platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had seen plenty of Marines come and go over his 15-year career. He'd learned to spot the ones who wouldn't make it past their first deployment, and unfortunately, Sarah Martinez fit that profile perfectly. She was too small, too quiet, and seemed to disappear into the background whenever the group gathered together. During their first meeting, he'd looked at her service record and shaken his head silently. Excellent marksmanship scores, outstanding academic performance, but physical fitness scores that were just barely passing. The other Marines in her unit weren't intentionally cruel, but military culture had a way of highlighting weaknesses quickly. They nicknamed her Pocket, partly because of her size and partly because she seemed to always be carrying extra gear for others who claimed their packs were too heavy. Sarah never refused these requests, even though it meant her own load became impossibly heavy during long marches across the desert training grounds. During weapons training, however, something interesting happened. While other Marines struggled with the precision required for long-distance shooting, Sarah's small frame actually became an advantage. She could hold positions longer without fatigue, and her steady hands made her one of the best marksmen in the entire company. Her instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, began to notice that this quiet young woman had skills that went far beyond what her physical appearance suggested. But marksmanship alone wasn't enough to change perceptions. During combat training exercises, Sarah was often assigned to support roles, rather than front-line positions. Her squad leader, Corporal Williams, genuinely believed he was protecting her by keeping her away from the simulated combat scenarios where physical strength mattered most. Sarah accepted these assignments without protest, but privately she felt frustrated by the constant assumption that she couldn't handle the same responsibilities as her male counterparts. The turning point came during a particularly grueling training exercise in the Mojave Desert. The scenario involved a simulated enemy attack on a forward operating base, and Sarah's squad was tasked with defending a strategic checkpoint. As the exercise began, things immediately went wrong. The opposing force was larger than expected, and within minutes several members of her squad were marked as casualties by the training observers. Corporal Williams took a simulated hit early in the engagement, leaving Sarah and 3 other Marines to hold their position. The remaining team members were Private Johnson, a massive former football player from Texas, Lance Corporal Brooks, a veteran of 2 previous deployments, and Private First Class Chen, who was known for his tactical intelligence but lacked experience in high-pressure situations. As the simulated enemy forces closed in on their position, Private Johnson made a tactical error that exposed their flank. In the chaos that followed, both he and Lance Corporal Brooks were marked as casualties. Suddenly, Sarah found herself alone with Private Chen, facing an overwhelming enemy force with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The training observers expected the exercise to end quickly. 2 Marines, one of whom was the smallest member of the entire company, couldn't possibly hold a defensive position against a numerically superior force. But Sarah had other plans. She quickly assessed their situation and realized that their position, while seemingly hopeless, actually provided excellent cover and multiple escape routes that larger Marines couldn't navigate. She instructed Chen to focus on providing covering fire while she moved through a series of narrow drainage culverts that ran beneath the checkpoint. These passages were too small for most Marines to navigate effectively. But Sarah's compact size allowed her to move through them quickly and quietly. While Chen kept the opposing force engaged from their original position, Sarah emerged behind enemy lines and began systematically eliminating their positions one by one. Her marksmanship skills, combined with her ability to move unseen through terrain that others considered impassable, allowed her to turn the tide of the battle completely. Within an hour, she had eliminated most of the opposing force and secured their objective. The training observers were stunned. They'd never seen a scenario flip so dramatically, especially with such limited personnel. Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through the base. Marines who had previously dismissed her as too small and weak suddenly began to see her differently. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called her into his office the next day, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Camp Pendleton, he seemed genuinely interested in her potential. However, not everyone was convinced. Some Marines argued that training exercises were different from real combat, where physical strength and size mattered more than clever tactics. Others suggested that she'd simply gotten lucky, and that her success was more about the specific terrain than any particular skill on her part. The nickname, Pocket, persisted, but now it carried a slightly different connotation. As her unit prepared for their upcoming deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah continued to prove herself in various training scenarios. She excelled at reconnaissance missions, where her small size allowed her to gather intelligence without being detected. Her medical training, which she'd pursued during her off-duty hours, made her valuable as a field medic. Most importantly, her calm demeanor under pressure began to earn the respect of Marines who had initially doubted her abilities.
The deployment orders came down in late spring.
Sarah's unit would be stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan, where they'd be responsible for patrolling the dangerous mountain regions along the Pakistani border. It was considered one of the more challenging assignments available, requiring Marines to operate in difficult terrain while facing an enemy that knew the landscape intimately. During the pre-deployment briefing, Sarah learned that her squad would be conducting regular patrols in areas where improvised explosive devices were common and where ambush attacks occurred frequently. The physical demands would be enormous, requiring Marines to carry heavy packs across mountainous terrain in extreme heat while remaining constantly alert for threats. Many Marines in the unit were excited about finally getting to put their training to use in real combat situations. Others were nervous about leaving behind families and facing genuine danger for the first time. Sarah felt a mixture of both emotions, but she was also determined to prove that she belonged among these warriors, regardless of her size. The night before they departed for Afghanistan, Sarah's squad gathered at a local bar near the base for what had become a traditional farewell celebration. As the evening progressed and the Marines shared stories about their backgrounds and motivations for joining the Corps, Sarah found herself opening up about her own journey. She told them about growing up in a small town in New Mexico, where her father had worked as a mechanic and her mother had taught elementary school. She'd always been smaller than her classmates, but she'd never let that stop her from participating in sports or other activities. When she decided to join the Marines after high school, her parents had been supportive but worried about her safety. Private Johnson, who had initially been among the most skeptical about Sarah's capabilities, listened to her story with growing respect. He admitted that his own prejudices had prevented him from seeing her potential earlier. Lance Corporal Brooks shared similar sentiments, acknowledging that he'd made assumptions based on her appearance rather than her performance. As the evening wound down, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined the group for a final toast. He looked around the table at his Marines and spoke about the importance of trusting each other completely once they were in combat. He reminded them that every member of the squad had unique strengths that would be crucial to their collective success and survival. Looking directly at Sarah, he said that he'd learned something important from watching her during training. Size and strength were just two factors among many that determined a Marine's effectiveness. Intelligence, determination, and the ability to remain calm under pressure were equally important, and Sarah had demonstrated all of those qualities consistently. The next morning, as they boarded the transport plane that would take them halfway around the world, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She'd worked harder than anyone to prove herself worthy of this opportunity, but she knew that real combat would test her in ways that training never could. The other Marines in her squad no longer openly questioned her abilities, but she sensed that some still harbored doubts about what would happen when they faced genuine life-and-death situations. During the long flight to Afghanistan, Sarah reviewed her medical training materials and studied maps of the region where they'd be operating. She'd volunteered to serve as the squad's primary medic in addition to her regular duties, knowing that this additional responsibility would make her more valuable to the team. The training had been intensive, covering everything from treating gunshot wounds to managing traumatic amputations in field conditions. As their plane descended toward Bagram Airfield, Sarah looked out the window at the harsh, mountainous landscape below. The terrain looked even more forbidding than she'd expected from the satellite photos they'd studied during training. She wondered how many of her fellow Marines would return home safely, and whether she'd be able to contribute to their survival in the challenging months ahead. The reality of war hit them immediately upon arrival. The base was constantly busy with helicopters coming and going, supply convoys preparing for dangerous journeys, and medical personnel treating wounded soldiers who'd been evacuated from forward positions. Sarah and her squad were assigned temporary quarters while they awaited transport to their permanent station at Forward Operating Base Chapman. During their brief stay at Bagram, Sarah had the opportunity to speak with Marines who were completing their tours and preparing to return home. Their stories were sobering. They spoke about the constant danger of improvised explosive devices, the difficulty of distinguishing between civilians and enemy combatants, and the emotional toll of losing fellow Marines to enemy fire. One sergeant, who was missing his left arm below the elbow, told Sarah that survival in Afghanistan depended more on mental toughness and quick thinking than on physical strength. He'd seen large, powerful Marines break down under the psychological pressure of constant threat, while smaller Marines like Sarah had proven remarkably resilient. His words gave her confidence, but they also reinforced the seriousness of what lay ahead. When the transport helicopter finally arrived to take them to Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sarah felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, and while she couldn't predict what specific situations would arise, she was confident in her training and her commitment to protecting her fellow Marines. The helicopter lifted off from Bagram and headed east toward the mountains, carrying Sarah toward her first real test as a United States Marine. Forward Operating Base Chapman sat like a small fortress carved into the Afghan mountains, surrounded by razor wire and concrete barriers that offered protection from the hostile territory beyond. When Sarah's helicopter touched down on the dusty landing pad, she immediately felt the weight of the place. The air was thin at this altitude, and the constant sound of generators mixed with distant gunfire created an atmosphere of perpetual tension. The base housed roughly 200 Marines and soldiers, along with supporting personnel and equipment necessary for operations in this remote region. Sarah's squad was assigned to living quarters that consisted of shipping containers converted into basic dormitories. The accommodations were Spartan, but after months of training exercises, Sarah found them comfortable enough. Captain Mitchell, the commanding officer responsible for their sector, briefed Sarah's unit on their mission parameters during their first day at Chapman. Their primary responsibility involved conducting regular patrols through villages scattered across the mountainous terrain, gathering intelligence about enemy movements, and disrupting insurgent activities whenever possible. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring long marches through difficult terrain while carrying full combat loads. The enemy they faced was unlike anything Sarah had encountered during training. The insurgents knew every trail, every cave, and every hiding place in these mountains. They used improvised explosive devices extensively, planted along routes that coalition forces traveled regularly. Sniper attacks were common, often coming from positions that were nearly impossible to detect until after the first shots were fired. Sarah's first patrol took place 3 days after her arrival. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led the squad through a valley that intelligence reports suggested contained a weapons cache hidden by insurgent forces. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks that made footing uncertain and narrow paths that provided limited options for movement or cover. As they moved through the valley, Sarah noticed details that her larger squad mates missed. Her medical training had taught her to observe carefully, and she spotted disturbed earth that suggested recent digging, unusual arrangements of stones that might mark hidden positions, and other subtle signs of human activity. When she quietly pointed these observations out to Rodriguez, he began to appreciate the value of having someone with her particular skills and perspective. The patrol lasted 14 hours and covered over 20 miles of mountain terrain. By the time they returned to base, several Marines were exhausted and suffering from dehydration despite carrying extra water. Sarah, however, seemed to have more energy remaining than anyone else. Her smaller body mass meant she required less water and food to maintain her strength, and her cardiovascular fitness allowed her to maintain a steady pace throughout the long march. Over the following weeks, Sarah participated in dozens of similar patrols. She quickly developed a reputation for spotting potential threats before others noticed them. and for maintaining her effectiveness even during the longest and most difficult missions. The other Marines began to request her presence on patrols, recognizing that her unique combination of skills made their missions safer and more successful. However, success in patrol operations was only one aspect of life at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The Marines also faced regular attacks on the base itself, usually consisting of mortar rounds or rocket-propelled grenades launched from surrounding mountains. During these attacks, all personnel were required to take defensive positions and be prepared to repel ground assaults if necessary. Sarah's assigned position during base defense operations was in a bunker overlooking the main approach route that vehicles used to reach Chapman. She shared this position with Lance Corporal Brooks and Private Johnson, both of whom had initially questioned her combat effectiveness. Now, after weeks of working together on patrols, they trusted her completely and valued her ability to remain calm and focused during high-stress situations. The first serious attack on Chapman occurred during Sarah's 6th week at the base. Intelligence reports had warned of increased insurgent activity in the area, but the assault came earlier and with more intensity than anyone had expected. The attack began at dawn with a coordinated mortar barrage that targeted key facilities within the base perimeter. Sarah was eating breakfast in the dining facility when the first mortar rounds began falling. The explosions were deafening, and the building shook violently with each impact. Marines immediately dropped their meals and ran toward their assigned defensive positions, grabbing weapons and equipment as they moved. Sarah reached her bunker within minutes and found Brooks and Johnson already in position, scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of the enemy. The mortar attack continued for nearly an hour, with rounds falling throughout the base in a pattern that suggested the insurgents had detailed knowledge of Chapman's layout. Several buildings sustained significant damage, and the medical facility reported multiple casualties among personnel who had been caught in the open when the attack began. Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations within the base, and she heard calls for medical assistance coming over the radio. As the mortar fire finally began to decrease in intensity, movement became visible on the mountainside surrounding Chapman. Insurgent fighters were approaching the base from multiple directions, apparently planning to launch a ground assault while the defenders were still recovering from the mortar bombardment. Sarah estimated that enemy forces numbered at least 50 fighters, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The defensive plan for Chapman called for Marines to hold predetermined positions while calling in air support to deal with attacking ground forces. However, cloud cover and ongoing mortar fire made it impossible for helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft to provide immediate assistance. The defenders would have to hold their positions using only their individual weapons and the base's limited heavy weapons systems. Sarah's position provided an excellent view of the main approach route, but it also made her bunker a priority target for attacking insurgents. Within minutes of the ground assault beginning, her position began receiving concentrated small arms fire from multiple directions. Bullets struck the concrete walls of the bunker constantly, creating a shower of concrete fragments that made it difficult to return effective fire. Despite the intensity of the incoming fire, Sarah remained calm and focused on identifying priority targets. Her marksmanship training served her well in this situation, as she was able to engage insurgent fighters at distances that exceeded the effective range of most other Marines in her unit. With each shot, she carefully selected targets that posed the greatest threat to the base's defenses. Private Johnson was manning the squad's automatic weapon, providing suppressing fire that kept enemy fighters from advancing too quickly toward the base perimeter. Lance Corporal Brooks was serving as the squad's communications specialist, maintaining contact with the base's command center and coordinating their defensive efforts with other positions. Sarah focused on precision shooting, eliminating individual insurgent fighters who were attempting to move closer to the base. The battle continued for several hours, with insurgent forces maintaining pressure on the base's defenses, while more Marines moved into position to repel the attack. Sarah noticed that enemy fighters seemed particularly focused on her position, perhaps because her accurate shooting had eliminated several of their key personnel. The incoming fire became so intense that it became difficult for any of the Marines in her bunker to expose themselves long enough to aim and shoot effectively. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sarah observed something that concerned her greatly. 2 insurgent fighters had managed to reach a position very close to the base perimeter, and they appeared to be preparing to launch rockets at the command center building. If they succeeded, the explosion would likely kill or wound most of the senior leadership responsible for coordinating Chapman's defenses. The enemy fighters were located in a position that couldn't be engaged effectively from her current location, but Sarah realized there was a maintenance trench that ran along the base perimeter and would allow her to reach a position where she could eliminate the threat. The trench was narrow and would require her to crawl a distance of nearly 200 yards while remaining undetected by enemy observers. Sarah explained her plan to Brooks and Johnson, both of whom immediately objected to the idea. The maintenance trench would provide some protection from small arms fire, but it would also leave her completely isolated from support if she encountered problems. Additionally, the route would take her very close to enemy positions, where discovery would almost certainly result in her death. However, Sarah pointed out that the threat to the command center was immediate, and that no other Marine in their unit was small enough to navigate the maintenance trench effectively. Brooks attempted to contact the command center to request permission for Sarah's planned movement, but communications were being disrupted by ongoing mortar fire and static from damaged radio equipment. Without waiting for official approval, Sarah gathered her weapon and extra ammunition, then began moving toward the maintenance trench. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, confirming her assessment that larger Marines wouldn't be able to navigate this route. As she began crawling through the trench, she could hear intense gunfire continuing above her, indicating that the battle was far from over. The journey through the maintenance trench was one of the most challenging experiences of Sarah's life. The space was cramped and filled with debris from the mortar bombardment, making movement slow and difficult. Several times, she had to stop and wait while enemy fighters moved directly overhead, close enough that she could hear their voices and footsteps through the concrete covering that protected the trench. After nearly an hour of careful movement, Sarah reached a position where she could observe the two insurgent fighters who threatened the command center. They were approximately 50 yards away, positioned behind a concrete barrier that provided excellent protection from most angles of attack. However, Sarah's position in the maintenance trench gave her a clear shot at both targets. She carefully aimed her rifle and eliminated the first fighter with a single shot. The second insurgent immediately began searching for the source of the gunfire, but Sarah's position in the trench made her virtually invisible from his location. Within seconds, she had eliminated the second threat as well, preventing the rocket attack on the command center. However, Sarah's gunfire had revealed her general location to other enemy fighters in the area. As she began moving back through the maintenance trench toward her original position, she could hear insurgents searching for her above ground. Several times, enemy fighters fired into the trench opening, hoping to hit her even though they couldn't see her exact location. The return journey through the trench was even more dangerous than the initial movement, as enemy forces were now actively hunting for her. Sarah had to move very slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to avoid detection. At one point, an insurgent fighter stood directly over her position and fired an entire magazine into the trench, with bullets passing within inches of her body. When Sarah finally reached her original position, she found that the battle was beginning to turn in favor of the base's defenders. Air support had finally arrived in the form of attack helicopters, which were systematically eliminating the remaining insurgent positions around Chapman's perimeter. The enemy fighters who had survived the initial assault were beginning to withdraw toward the surrounding mountains. Brooks and Johnson were relieved to see Sarah return safely, but they were also amazed by what she had accomplished during her solo mission through the maintenance trench. Her elimination of the two insurgents who threatened the command center had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of leadership during the middle of the battle. The attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman lasted a total of 8 hours, making it one of the longest and most intense assaults that the base had experienced since its establishment. When the fighting finally ended, damage assessment revealed that several buildings had been destroyed or severely damaged, and that 14 Marines had been wounded during the engagement. However, there had been no fatalities among the defenders, a remarkable outcome considering the scale and intensity of the attack. Captain Mitchell personally visited Sarah's position after the battle to thank her for her actions during the assault. Her willingness to undertake a dangerous solo mission to eliminate threats to the command center had demonstrated both exceptional courage and tactical intelligence. More importantly, her success had prevented casualties among the base's leadership that could have compromised their ability to coordinate defenses effectively. Word of Sarah's actions during the battle spread quickly throughout Forward Operating Base Chapman. Marines who had previously questioned her effectiveness in combat situations now spoke of her with genuine respect and admiration. The nickname Pocket took on an entirely new meaning, suggesting someone who could accomplish important missions in situations where larger Marines would be ineffective. 3 months after the major assault on Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sarah had established herself as one of the most valuable Marines in her unit. Her combination of medical training, exceptional marksmanship, and ability to operate effectively in confined spaces made her essential for many types of missions. However, the ultimate test of her capabilities was still to come. The mission that would define Sarah's military career began with intelligence reports indicating that a high-value insurgent leader was hiding in a remote village approximately 15 miles from Chapman. This particular individual was believed responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region, and his capture or elimination was considered a top priority for military commanders. The village where the target was reportedly hiding sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountain walls. The terrain made it impossible to approach undetected using vehicles, and the single trail leading to the village was likely monitored by insurgent lookouts. Any successful operation would require Marines to move on foot across difficult ground while carrying full combat equipment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez selected Sarah for the mission team, along with 5 other Marines chosen for their specific skills and experience. The team included Private Johnson, whose size and strength made him valuable for carrying heavy equipment; Lance Corporal Brooks, who served as the team's communications specialist; Sergeant Davis, an experienced squad leader with extensive combat experience; Private Martinez, a demolitions expert; and Corporal Thompson, whose knowledge of local languages would be crucial for interacting with villagers. The mission plan called for the team to move during darkness across the mountains to reach an observation position overlooking the target village. From there, they would conduct surveillance to confirm the presence of their target and develop a plan for either capturing him or eliminating him if capture proved impossible. The entire operation was expected to last approximately 48 hours, including movement to and from the target area. Sarah's role on the mission team combined her medical training with her skills as a marksman. She would be responsible for treating any wounded team members, and she would also serve as the team's designated precision shooter if long-range engagement became necessary. Additionally, her small size made her ideal for reconnaissance activities that might require movement through confined spaces or areas where larger Marines would be easily detected. The team departed Forward Operating Base Chapman just after midnight on a moonless night that provided excellent concealment for their movement. Each Marine carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and communications gear. The weight was distributed carefully to maintain mobility while ensuring that the team had everything necessary for success. The initial phase of their movement took them across relatively easy terrain consisting of rocky slopes and narrow valleys. Sarah had no difficulty maintaining the pace set by Sergeant Davis, and she actually found herself moving more quietly than some of the larger Marines who occasionally dislodged rocks or disturbed vegetation as they passed. Her smaller footprint and lighter weight gave her a significant advantage when stealth was important. After 4 hours of continuous movement, the team reached a position approximately 3 miles from the target village. They established a temporary rest stop in a cave that provided concealment from potential enemy observers, and they consumed a quick meal while reviewing their plan for the final approach to their observation position. The last phase of their movement would be the most dangerous, as they would be traveling through an area where insurgent patrols were known to operate regularly. Additionally, the terrain became increasingly difficult as they approached the village, with steep rocky slopes that required careful navigation to avoid falling or creating noise that might alert enemy forces. Sarah noticed that Private Martinez was beginning to show signs of fatigue and dehydration despite their rest stop. His breathing was labored, and he was sweating heavily, even though the mountain air was cool. As the team's medic, she quietly assessed his condition and determined that he was experiencing early symptoms of heat exhaustion, likely caused by carrying too much equipment over the difficult terrain. She recommended to Sergeant Davis that Martinez be given additional water and a longer rest period before continuing with the mission. However, Davis was concerned about falling behind their planned timeline, as they needed to reach their observation position before dawn to avoid being spotted by villagers or enemy forces. He decided that the team should continue moving, with Sarah monitoring Martinez's condition carefully. The final approach to their observation position required the team to climb a steep rocky slope that rose nearly 800 feet above the valley floor. The route was treacherous, with loose rocks that could easily cause a fall and several sections where Marines had to use their hands as well as their feet to maintain their grip on the mountainside. Halfway up the slope, Private Martinez collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. His condition had deteriorated rapidly during the climb, and he was no longer able to continue without assistance. Sarah immediately began treating him with oral rehydration fluids, but his condition was serious enough that he would require significant recovery time before he could move safely. Sergeant Davis faced a difficult decision. The mission timeline was critical, as intelligence reports suggested that their target might be leaving the village within the next 24 hours. However, Martinez clearly needed medical attention, and leaving him behind without proper care could result in his death from heat stroke or other complications related to his condition. The team's original plan had accounted for the possibility of casualties during the mission, but they had expected such problems to occur during actual combat rather than during the approach phase. Now they faced the challenge of continuing their mission while ensuring that Martinez received appropriate medical care in a location where evacuation was impossible. Sarah volunteered to remain with Martinez while the rest of the team continued to their observation position. She argued that her medical training made her the logical choice for providing care, and that the other Marines could complete the surveillance and engagement phases of the mission without her direct participation. However, Davis pointed out that her marksmanship skills might be crucial if the mission required precision shooting. After considering their options carefully, Davis decided that the entire team would continue to their observation position, but that they would carry Martinez between them to ensure he received proper medical attention. This decision significantly slowed their movement and required them to modify their route to find paths that could accommodate a casualty who couldn't walk independently. Sarah took primary responsibility for Martinez's care during the continued movement up the mountain. She monitored his vital signs continuously, administered additional fluids when possible, and adjusted his equipment load to reduce the physical stress on his body. Her medical training proved invaluable in keeping him stable during what became an increasingly difficult evacuation. The team reached their observation position just as dawn was beginning to break over the mountain ridges. The location provided an excellent view of the target village while offering good concealment for their activities. However, their delayed arrival meant they had lost several hours that could have been used for surveillance and mission planning. From their observation position, Sarah could see the village clearly through her rifle scope. The settlement consisted of approximately 20 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with terraced fields extending up the mountainsides around the valley. Several goat herds grazed in the surrounding areas, and women could be seen moving between buildings as they began their daily activities. Private Martinez's condition had stabilized during their movement to the observation position, but he was still weak and would require additional recovery time before he could participate in any strenuous activity. Sarah continued monitoring his condition while also conducting surveillance of the village to identify potential targets and assess the security situation. Over the following several hours, the team observed various individuals moving through the village, but none matched the description of their primary target. Communications with Forward Operating Base Chapman confirmed that intelligence reports still indicated the target was present in the village, but his exact location and activities remained unknown. As afternoon approached, Sarah noticed unusual activity in one particular building at the center of the village. Several men had entered the structure during the morning, but none had emerged, despite the passage of many hours. Additionally, she observed that guards had been posted around the building, suggesting that something important was happening inside. Using her rifle scope, Sarah was able to identify one individual who matched the general description of their target. However, the distance and angle made positive identification difficult, and Sergeant Davis was reluctant to authorize any action without greater certainty about the individual's identity. The situation changed dramatically when Sarah observed their confirmed target emerging from the building and walking toward a vehicle parked at the edge of the village. Intelligence reports had indicated that the individual might be planning to leave the area, and his movement toward transportation suggested that this departure could be imminent. Davis made the decision to attempt capture of the target using a coordinated approach that would surround the building and prevent his escape. However, as the team began moving toward the village, they encountered an insurgent patrol that was apparently conducting security sweeps in the area around the settlement. The engagement began when Lance Corporal Brooks accidentally dislodged a rock while moving down the mountainside toward the village. The sound alerted the insurgent patrol to their presence, and within seconds, both sides were exchanging gunfire across the rocky terrain that separated them from the village. Sarah found herself in a position where she could provide covering fire for her team while they maneuvered against the insurgent patrol. Her marksmanship skills proved crucial in this situation, as she was able to engage individual targets at distances that exceeded the effective range of most other weapons being used by either side. However, the firefight also alerted insurgent forces in the village to their presence, eliminating any possibility of achieving surprise in their mission to capture the high-value target. Davis decided that the team's priority should shift to breaking contact with the enemy patrol and returning safely to forward operating base Chapman. During the firefight, both Sergeant Davis and Corporal Thompson sustained serious wounds from insurgent gunfire. Davis had been hit in the leg by a bullet that fractured his femur, while Thompson had taken shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded near his position. Both Marines were conscious but unable to move without assistance. Sarah immediately moved to provide medical treatment for the wounded Marines, while the remaining team members continued engaging the insurgent patrol. Davis's leg wound was bleeding heavily and required immediate attention to prevent him from going into shock. Thompson's shrapnel wounds were less immediately life-threatening but still required treatment to prevent infection and additional complications. Working under fire, Sarah applied tourniquets and pressure bandages to control bleeding from both casualties. Her medical training allowed her to stabilize their conditions quickly, but both Marines would require evacuation to receive definitive medical care. The problem was that their location made helicopter evacuation impossible, and they were too far from forward operating base Chapman to request immediate ground support. Private Johnson and Lance Corporal Brooks were still engaged with the insurgent patrol, but ammunition was running low, and enemy forces appeared to be receiving reinforcements from the village. Davis, despite his wound, attempted to coordinate the team's movement toward a more defensible position, but his injury limited his mobility significantly. Sarah realized that the team faced a critical decision point. They could attempt to hold their current position and call for reinforcement, but help was many hours away, and their ammunition would likely be exhausted long before assistance arrived. Alternatively, they could attempt to move the wounded Marines to a location where helicopter evacuation might be possible, but this would require carrying two seriously injured men across several miles of difficult terrain while being pursued by enemy forces. The situation deteriorated further when Private Martinez, who had been recovering from his earlier heat exhaustion, was wounded by sniper fire from insurgents who had moved to higher ground around their position. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, creating another casualty who would require medical attention and assistance with movement. Now Sarah found herself responsible for treating 3 wounded Marines while enemy forces continued to maintain pressure on their position. Johnson and Brooks were still returning fire, but their ammunition situation was becoming critical, and they were being outflanked by insurgents who knew the terrain intimately. Sarah made the decision that would define her legacy as a United States Marine. She informed Davis that she would carry the 2 most seriously wounded Marines to a helicopter landing zone, approximately 2 miles from their current position. The route would take them through difficult terrain, but it represented their best chance for survival. Davis initially objected to this plan, arguing that Sarah was too small to carry wounded Marines across such a distance. However, she pointed out that no other options were available, and that remaining in their current position would likely result in the death of all team members when their ammunition was exhausted. Using techniques from her medical training, Sarah fashioned improvised carrying devices that would allow her to transport the wounded Marines more efficiently. She also redistributed equipment among team members to reduce weight while ensuring that essential items remained available. Her plan called for Johnson and Brooks to provide rear-guard action while she moved the casualties toward the evacuation point. The movement began immediately, with Sarah carrying Sergeant Davis in a modified fireman's carry that distributed his weight across her shoulders and back. The technique was exhausting, but it allowed her to move steadily across the rocky terrain while maintaining her balance and avoiding falls that could injure both of them. After moving Davis approximately half a mile toward the evacuation point, Sarah returned for Corporal Thompson, who was semi-conscious but still able to assist slightly with his own movement. The return trip was even more difficult, as insurgent forces were actively searching for the team, and several times Sarah had to stop and remain motionless while enemy patrols passed nearby. The process of moving both casualties to the evacuation point took Sarah nearly 6 hours of continuous physical effort. During this time, she made multiple trips back and forth across the terrain, carrying first one Marine and then the other, while gradually moving both toward safety. The physical demands were enormous, but her determination to save her fellow Marines kept her going even when her muscles were screaming with fatigue. Johnson and Brooks maintained a fighting withdrawal that kept enemy forces from overrunning their position, but they were gradually being forced back toward the evacuation point as well. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and they had both sustained minor wounds during the extended firefight. When Sarah finally reached the helicopter landing zone with both wounded Marines, she immediately called for medical evacuation using their emergency communications equipment. The response time was approximately 45 minutes, during which she continued providing medical care while Johnson and Brooks established a defensive perimeter around their position. The evacuation helicopter arrived just as insurgent forces were beginning to close in on their position. Sarah helped load the wounded Marines aboard the aircraft, then provided covering fire as the remaining team members boarded as well. The helicopter departed under enemy fire, but all team members survived the mission despite its dramatic complications. The flight back to Forward Operating Base Chapman took 20 minutes, during which Sarah continued monitoring the condition of the wounded Marines. Both Davis and Thompson were conscious and stable when they arrived at the base medical facility, where they received immediate surgical treatment for their injuries. Martinez's shoulder wound was less serious and required only outpatient treatment. Word of Sarah's actions during the mission spread throughout the entire base within hours of their return. The story of the small Marine who had carried two wounded comrades across miles of enemy territory under fire became legendary among the personnel stationed at Chapman. Captain Mitchell submitted a formal recommendation for Sarah to receive the Silver Star, the military's third highest decoration for valor in combat. More importantly, Sarah's actions during the mission completely changed how other Marines viewed her capabilities. No one would ever again question whether she belonged among the elite warriors of the United States Marine Corps. Her courage, strength, and determination had been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible, and she had proven herself capable of extraordinary heroism when her fellow Marines needed her most. The nickname Pocket took on its final transformation, becoming a term of respect and admiration rather than one suggesting weakness or inadequacy. Sarah Martinez had entered the Marine Corps as someone whom others considered the weak link in their unit. She had emerged from the mountains of Afghanistan as a decorated hero whose actions had saved the lives of her fellow warriors.